everybody. My name is Abby Noy. I'm the Extension Educator here at the University of Minnesota for Poultry. And this is our annual Lunch and Learn webinar. It's changing how it looks this year. I'm hoping to shift to a 3 or 4 time a year lunchtime webinar, half an hour, quick information, what you need to know, and they will all be recorded, archived on our YouTube channel, etc. So I'm pleased to have Gabi Furo here today, who's a PhD student in the Animal Science Department. She's studying and being mentored by Dr. Sally Knoll. And she's going to share with us today her information and the research findings that she discovered about Footpad Dermatitis in turkeys. So again, if you have a question for Gabi as she's presenting, enter it into the chat box or raise your hand with the little icon. Or press the space bar at the end of the presentation, and that should be able to take you off of mute. So I will hand it over to Gabi. There you go.
Thank you so much, Abby, for this nice introduction, and I would like to welcome everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today and talk about our learnings, what we learned about Footpad dermatitis in turkeys. I would like to talk about this topic because it's really important, and I also like to mention facts or introduce facts. Why should we care about Footpad dermatitis? And I will also talk about how the bedding can reduce the footpad lesions. So at first I would like to talk about the Footpad dermatitis. What is this exactly? What's the frequency, the occurrence of this condition? Why should we care? And then talk about how the bedding can affect the turkey hen performance, also the footpad lesions and litter characteristics, and give an overall study summary. So at first I would like to start out with my background. So I'm coming from Hungary, and I try to do my best today with my Hungarish. So I'm really pleased because I'm coming from a family farm, so talking to farmers and industry is really something I like to do. So our family farm is focusing on meat and liver type breeder geese, and we sell mostly day-old goslings from the hatchery, but we also sell eggs and frozen whole bodies, so we are really versatile. And we also have a little crop production to feed our animals. Mostly we produce corn and oats. So currently I'm a PhD student at the University of Minnesota studying animal science with Dr. Knoll, and I hold an MS degree in animal science received from the University of Minnesota, and also have a master's degree in agribusiness from Hungary. So at first, what is exactly the Footpad dermatitis? So this is a skin inflammation that causes lesions on the plantar surface of poultry footpads. And as you can see here, for the non-affected foot, we can see no discolorations, no scars, no lesions at all. And as the Footpad dermatitis, the lesions started to progress, then some reddening, some discoloration, hyperkeratosis, which means thickened scales, thickened skin can be seen on the footpads, and later on some black, brown discolorations, ulcers and necrotic lesions can be seen. So Footpad dermatitis is a really frequently occurring condition in turkeys. Over 95% of turkey toms at market age will develop some sort of lesion. So we really have to pay attention and know what's the Footpad score or Footpad status in our flock, because that can impact the welfare and has some economic concerns as well. So the most severe lesions are associated with some kind of pain in the turkeys. Therefore, this is a welfare concern. And also severe lesions can affect the turkey performance for the live production in turkey houses, and also can result in higher leg trim in the slaughterhouses. Turkeys with severe lesion, they exhibit less active behavior and they rest more. And the severe lesions may be present without obvious effect on gait. So scoring the gait or just observing the flux or the locomotion of our turkeys in a barn, it may be not necessary and not sufficient to evaluate the footpad lesions. The severe lesions can also affect the turkey performance. If 20 or 30% of the footpad was ulcerated, then research studies observed 5 to 9% body weight reduction. And another study found no body weight differences, but 12% higher feed intake. So the cause of footpad dermatitis is multifactorial. However, the wet litter, the high litter moisture is the most important culprit. So litter moisture above 25–30% will exceed or will speed up the development of footpad lesions. Therefore, we have to be really concerned and we have to know our litter moisture in the barn. So selection of the more appropriate bedding material which has better characteristics for animal housing or controlling the relative humidity in the barns, ventilation and barn temperature is really important to have a prevention of these footpad lesions and wet litter. So this slide shows the complexity of the wet litter. So basically can start with the weather and environmental factors such as the excess rain can enter the barns through the leakage, or the drinking system malfunctions of the drinking system can add a lot of moisture, a lot of water can result in flood in the poultry houses. Also, relative humidity and ventilation and heating, it's really important because the wet, because in higher temperature, the moisture holds more water, so that will make difficult to evaporate the litter moisture from the litter, so that will contribute and result in higher litter moisture. Factors such as diet and nutrition or health and disease can also contribute to higher litter moisture through the increased excreta moisture. So there is another thing to consider. So what can be done to reduce the litter moisture in turkey houses? The most important thing is the prevention. So selecting better bedding material which has higher, for example, water holding capacity or water releasing capacity is really important. Check the litter moisture frequently, as I mentioned earlier, to check wet spots in the barn, which can be like the result of leakage on the wall. Using the heating and ventilation wisely and checking drinkers, roof walls for leakage is also simple things to really control the litter moisture in the turkey houses. However, we can also check the litter moisture. So a simple test to check this is to grab a handful of litter and squeeze it. And if it adheres, then the moisture is above 30%. But if it still stay friable, then the moisture is most likely below 30%. This is important because the wet litter has negative consequences on the bird performance and welfare. And we also know that severe lesions can heal in 2 weeks. Therefore, keeping the moisture low, the litter moisture low, is essential. However, we are talking about keeping the moisture below 30% when we are talking about footpad lesion or reduction or minimizing. However, there are like negative consequences of really dry litter, such as more dust in the air, which not compromises only the bird health, but also can be harmful for the people working in the barns. So selection of the bedding is really important, as the main function of the bedding to keep away birds and the moisture. Therefore, the ideal bedding has to be non-toxic, lightweight, inexpensive, and available. And characteristics such as better water holding and releasing capacity is really beneficial. For example, wood shavings has better water holding and releasing capacity as compared to the rice hulls. So therefore, if we have option to choose the wood shavings, is it better compared to the rice hull? Another important thing is to consider the particle size distribution of the litter. So as the picture illustrates, this is a wood shavings bedding and the coin. So you can see that there are like larger flakes, which is like equivalent in size of a coin, but most likely the particles are less than the coin size. And what we learned from our studies so far is that the particle size, the litter moisture, and the footpad scores can affect each other, can influence each other. So researchers at the University of Minnesota and the Penn State University collaborated on a pen trial to study two different kinds of beddings. The pine shavings, which is the most popular, most frequently used bedding material in the United States in the poultry houses, and the giant miscanthus grass, which is an alternative bedding. So as I mentioned, this study was carried out at the Penn State University. Over 1,000 turkey hen poults were raised 14 weeks on these two beddings, pine shavings and giant miscanthus grass. As I mentioned, the pine shavings is the most frequently used bedding material. However, the availability can be hectic, and cannot be always available. The giant miscanthus grass, this is an alternative bedding source. This is a perennial energy crop, what the farmers can grow on their farms, or the neighbors can grow it. It's a warm season grass, but it can be grown in Minnesota and even in Canada. And it has been tested for animal bedding, and some research studies observed really good results, and they concluded that this is it can be a good option for housing animals. Some pictures illustrating how can be the giant miscanthus grass grown. For the study, we did several measurements. Some of them was for comparing the performance of birds, of turkey hens, such as the body weight, feed intake, feed conversion ratio. We were also interested in the footpad health, as this is a welfare indicator. And we did several litter measurements, most importantly, the moisture and particle size distribution. The footpad health was evaluated with this 2-point scale, where score 0 is given if we don't see any discolorations, scars on the footpad, and score 2 for severe and deep lesions, where we can see necrotic lesions, deep lesions, and ulcers and scabs. For evaluating the footpad scores, we did two different kind of footpad scores. First, we scored every single footpad for every bird in a pen, and then we took the pen average footpad score. And also we calculated that how many birds we can find in a pen with footpad score 0, 1, and 2. So we did a distribution. For the particle size distribution, we used 10 different sieves to see how much of the mass retained by these sieves. As I said, we had 10 sieves. It's called US standards 4 until 100. And the openings ranged, this was the largest, 5 millimeter, which is like this. I think it's like a 1/4 inch. So that was the largest openings. And we had less and less and less, so smaller and smaller openings. To analyze the particle size distribution, we put the samples, we removed the lid, and we put the samples on the top of the largest opening sieves. And then after 5-minute operation, the retained mass was weighed back. So for the results, when we look at the performance data, we saw that the turkey hens kept on miscanthus grass performed equally well as compared to the pine shavings. In the first 2 weeks, we found a 2 weeks improvement on miscanthus grass for feed conversion ratio. However, that was observed only in the first 2 weeks, and we didn't see any significant differences at the end of the study or any long-term effects. And at the end of the study, we saw a 5% lower feed intake for the birds kept on miscanthus grass. However, we cannot just evaluate the performance per se. We also have to consider the welfare indication. That's why we use the footpad evaluation, and we have to interpret the results together. And what we found, that we found higher footpad scores. If you look at here, the black dots represents the average pen footpad scores for the pine shavings and miscanthus grass birds at 14 weeks of age. And what we found, then we found 0.75, which is closer to the medium lesions, and found 1.43 for the miscanthus grass, which is between the medium and severe lesions. So we found more severe lesions on miscanthus grass treatment, and it can be that lower feed intake was related to ongoing footpad lesions or footpad inflammation, and that was the reason. Also, when we look at the proportion of hens with footpad score 0, 1, and 2, marked with green, yellow, and red colors, we found that ideally we would like to see more of green color for footpad score 0, defining no lesions. But what we found like 40% no lesions, 50%, which was like really similar for both treatments. And for pine shavings, we found 10% of severe lesions here. However, for miscanthus grass, we found almost 50% of the birds had severe lesions. So in summary, we found that the birds on pine shavings bedding had less severe footpad lesions. We also look at the relationship of litter moisture and footpad scores. On the x-axis, you can see the footpad scores ranging between 0 and 2. And on the y-axis, we can see the litter moisture between 30 and 70%. The red dots symbolizes the pine shavings pens treatments, and the greens are for the miscanthus grass. And what we found, that as the footpad scores increased, the litter moisture increased as well. So we found more severe footpad scores and higher litter moistures, more likely associated with the green dots with the miscanthus grass treatments compared to the pine shavings. Also, we did some correlation, and we found a moderate correlation with 0.76, which means that as the footpad score is increasing, the litter moisture is increasing as well. When we look at the result of particle size distribution for 4.8 millimeter, which is like the size of an erase of a pencil end, we found that the miscanthus grass 72% was associated with larger particle size, and for the miscanthus, for the pine wood shavings, most shavings was associated with finer particle size. So when we look at the summary of the study, we learned that the performance was improved on miscanthus grass bedding. However, for food conversion ratio, it was like just in the first 2 weeks. And for the feed intake, it was in the last 2 weeks. But as I said, lower feed intake and higher Footpad scores and higher litter moisture was seen on miscanthus grass at the end of the study. And also larger particles was associated with miscanthus grass. When we look at the wood shavings, we found that the performance was less advanced or not as good as we saw on the miscanthus grass. However, we saw lower Footpad scores, which is good, and lower litter moisture. And also when we look at the particle size distribution, we saw that the wood shavings was associated more likely with finer particle size. So for conclusions, we saw that the bedding influenced the particle size, and the particle size is associated with Footpad lesions. We also saw that the pen with larger particle size exhibited more severe lesions. And for future directions, for this study, we compared 2 different kinds of beddings, and we kind of compared how the particle size distribution was different among these 2 different bedding sources. But for future directions, we would like to see the effect of particle size distribution on the same beddings, and particularly on wood shavings bedding, because we kind of hypothesized that the finer particle size distribution is associated with better water holding and releasing capacity for wood shavings bedding, and that can also positively influence the performance and also the Footpad scores. So the take-home message for today is that we have to learn what's the Footpad status, what's the Footpad health in our turkey flocks, because it can impact also the welfare and our profitability. And we also have to know what's the litter moisture in our turkey houses, because besides the negative consequences on Footpad scores, the wet litter also has negative consequences on the turkey performance and welfare. We have several fact sheets to help you to determine the Footpad dermatitis lesions and prevalence in your flocks, and also how to check the bedding materials. And we are posting many interesting information about turkey on the Poultry Extension website. Oh, it's getting over. My presentation is ending. So I would like to thank you for everyone who has been working on this extension series and who have helped on this project. Thank you for your attention. And if you have questions, you can raise it now, or also you can reach me on my website, on my email address, and I will do my best to answer your questions. So thank you so much. And if you have questions, then let me know.
Are there any questions now?
Yeah, I'm turning to Abby because I'm not.
I'm just going to join the frame. Thank you, Gabi, for joining us and getting us started on this new webinar series. There's one question about your background. It doesn't have to do with your research, but your background. What is liver type geese? What does that mean?
That means that those are the gray. For color, if you just look at the geese, most likely you will see that either they are white, which is for the meat type, or they are most likely gray in color, and those are producing liver type geese. So the goose production in Hungary, those are for export markets, for most likely going to either Germany, that's the market buying meat type geese, or most likely France, where they are interested in foie gras. So force feed geese, goose liver, and we are producing goslings to sell these, and then people will raise our goslings, and then they will sell it to the slaughterhouses.
Okay, that's what that. So they're interested in the liver.
The liver, yes.
In itself. Okay. And then another question is, you mentioned keeping your litter moisture below 30%. From your pen study, what would be your recommendation for a minimum litter moisture?
So this is really interesting because many research studies and many extension services, they advocate to keep the litter moisture low, around 30% or even lower. But for a commercial turkey house, this is really difficult to do. And there are a few studies, or even what we kind of learned from our study, that even we had in our study what I just showed you, around like low 50, high 40 something litter moisture, and we didn't see as adverse negative effect on footpad health as we thought it would be, based on the recommendation and what is available. So our opinion about that was that it's like the ideal litter moisture can be higher than 30, so 40, or it's like high 40 maybe. But I think this is like an interactive and an ongoing process. So we have to like go to the barn every day and just look what we can see, evaluate the animals, looking at their footpad health. It's like continue to do. So even, you know, if we can just do this quick test for just to test the litter moisture, maybe we will see that it adheres. So that can be like something to pay attention. But this we have to like consider together with the performance data, together with the footpad data and other indicators. So this is a big picture.
So there's a little bit of wiggle room, yes, above that 30%. So between 30 and 40%, ideally.
Ideally, as I said, that we have to like go in the barn and see with our eyes. Yeah,
check it out. So with the squeeze test you mentioned again, so you still want to be able to form a ball of litter, but not have any excrement squeeze out of it, but it would still stay. What does that 40% look like for a producer, or what would it feel like?
It's really difficult because like we have several different areas within the barn. We have like the feeders, the drinkers, there are some resting area. So is it possible to like under the drinker lines, it is a little bit higher and it's lower in the resting area. So it's like we have to, like the farmers, they have to be familiar with this like squeeze test, the performance data.
They'll know what works.
Yeah, I think that the key is to consider many different things and to compile a big picture.
It's a whole system.
Yes.
Awesome. Good. There's another question of the squeeze test. Does that also work for other types of poultry housing in your experience? Could that work for chickens? Would it also work for ducks, etc.? I realized the dermatitis research you did was about turkeys, but
yes,
on a bigger scale for poultry production, would that squeeze test work?
I think it would, because for the squeeze test, it's testing the litter moisture. And what is litter moisture? So it's like water, spilled feeds, excreta, like many other things, which is like common in poultry houses. So it's not specific to turkeys. It also can be used for chickens or ducks as well, because it's testing the litter and the litter moisture.
Again, thank you, Gabi, for joining us today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we'll see you next time.